I guess maybe he is. Okay. Well, here we go. We're in chapter 6, verse 8. That's where we're going to start. Um, I've looked at things and I thought, you know what? We why don't we go ahead and we'll start in verse 8, chapter 6, and we'll go all the way through chapter 9 to verse 24. That'll be what our study will cover tonight. I changed it a little bit. I started looking at things and realized, you know what, there's a lot of information here that really is, and it's all important. All of God's word's important. But some things I don't understand well enough to know the importance, if you'll understand what I'm saying. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm not going to go line by line through here. We'll go principle to principle for the most part and see how that turns out. So number one in our notes, this is the priestly instructions concerning the Olah, the Mincha, the Zavav, the Ha'atat, and the Asham offerings. So what we have here is, in our notes, the transition from wilderness living to living in the land. It changed some things when they moved from the wilderness to the moving into the land. And so we need to see that. So I want to just read verse 8 and 9. It says, the Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law for the burnt offering. And we go on from there. What happened when we changed from the wilderness to moving into the land? One of the things that changed is we had the freedom of choice to eat meat or not, apart from its temple restrictions. Pretty much all the meat that was eaten during the time that Israel was in the wilderness, all of it had to be sacrificed at the temple, and then you got to take the parts that were allotted to you that you could eat. You got to eat those and share in the meat. So there really wasn't a whole lot of meat that was eaten uh, because taking it to the temple, going through the procedure, only getting a certain portion of it, didn't make it really very viable. And so the eating of meat, plus you really, one thing I guess we have to think about is if there were 3 million plus people, that's a very large community. And living in a desert area, you got to remember that when Israel left Egypt, they walked out with a lot of wealth, a lot of money, if you will, at least with a lot of things to trade. And so all the trading that would come through the Middle East would, of course, come right through where Israel was camped out in the desert. And we got to remember, I'm pretty sure they were trading and bartering for things. I mean, all the linen and all that stuff that they had and got actually for the priest's clothing. That was something that would have been traded very commonly during that time frame. And so the flocks that they had, they may have very well been trading flocks for merchandise, animals for merchandise. But as far as eating the meat themselves, probably they didn't eat very much meat at all. But when they moved back into their own land, into the land of Canaan, the promised land, then they had the choice given to them to eat meat or not, apart from his temple restrictions. So, in our notes, animals could then be slaughtered for consumption, apart from the tabernacle procedure. And along with that, when the animal was slaughtered as a sacrifice, with God's portions at the temple, they could be used any way that Yahweh wanted them to be used. And so we find out that God did very specifically determine what was to be used of all of the sacrifices, how they were to be used. He placed restrictions on them depending on who was bringing the sacrifice and who the sacrifice was for and what it was for. And so a great deal of what we've learned already had to deal with the common normal Israelite bringing an offering to the temple, wanting to draw close to God, wanting to honor God. and all of those things that God had instructed. In this particular section we're in now, we're going to be dealing with the priestly responsibilities, both in regards to the offerings that they would make for themselves and what they were supposed to be doing and how they were supposed to be doing it when they were serving the people as well. So God's portions at the temple could be used any way that he instructed, and so he did give a bunch of instructions for that. Number one underneath there is the semika, the laying on of hands, signified a change of ownership, from the offerer to Yahweh. When you laid your hands on the animal, it carried a couple of significant things that transpired. One was, yes, you were identifying with that animal, and that animal was going to be the animal that was sacrificed in your place, on one hand. It also indicated a change of ownership. When you brought it, the animal or whatever offering of any kind, and we talked about that being today as well, when you make an offering as unto the Lord, the ownership of what you're offering then becomes Yahweh's. And once it's his, it's really not your business to know what he does with it or if he wants to do this or that. It's up to him. So A in our notes underneath one was, at salvation, we are no longer our own. We all know that, but sometimes we have a tendency to forget that. But Romans 12:1 says this to us. It says, therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. So that's Romans 12:1. Number two in our notes here, Moses lit the brazen altar, dedication fire. That's Exodus 40:29, Leviticus 8. We read in Exodus 40, he said, he set the altar of burning offering before the doorway of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and offered on it the burnt offering and the meal offering, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then in chapter 8, verse 16 here, and Moses offered it up in smoke upon the altar. Well, when Moses was doing all of this offering, God had not yet lit the fire. We find out he lit the fire actually in 6:9, I think here. No, it's not 6:9, excuse me. It's supposed to be Leviticus 9:24. Okay, I just read the wrong place. I do have it the right one there. I thought, did I put the wrong verse on there? But no, I just read the wrong place. So it is Leviticus 9:24, where it says, then fire came from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. So that happens at the very end of chapter 9, after all of the other things that Moses had to do in dedicating the altar and consecrating the priests and all of those things. Once he had completed his task, and then Aaron, as the high priest, the anointed priest, fulfilled his obligations, made the offerings, and it's all of that business. Then is when Yahweh lit the consuming fire that came out and took and consumed all of the offerings that were placed on the altar. So A in our notes, the fire on the brazen altar must be kept lit and prevented from going out. That's Leviticus 6:9, which says, this is the law for the burnt offering. The fire on the altar is to be kept burning. Now, that burning of the altar, the fire on the altar, we have to think of that in a couple of contexts. Here, God gave very specific instructions as to what was to happen. It was supposed to burn all day and it was supposed to burn all night. And Romans 11:16 where it says holy to holy. It says if the root is holy, then so are the branches. In regards to starting the fire, Moses started the fire here in order to accomplish what needed to be done. But when God starts the fire, that fire is never, ever to be allowed to go out. And so God's absolutely, of course, we realize he starts the relationship with you and I. We don't go seeking God. He comes seeking us. If we listen, then we're drawn to him. But he is the initiator. So in our relationship with him, this Romans 11:16 makes sense to us. It's holy to holy. And I say holy to holy here for this reason. We realize that the first step in our relationship with God has to be salvation. Salvation was the first step for Israel. God's Torah is not for anybody except for those that are saved. You don't do the Torah first and then get saved. You get saved, and then out of obedience, you start practicing the Torah, like Yeshua said in John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. So if the root is holy, then so are the branches. Yahweh started your fire, and it has to be one of the things we've learned, that anything that comes in contact with anything that's holy, if it is not of an equal value, then whatever has touched something that's holy is destroyed. Well, through our relationship with Yeshua, that's a reason we have to get saved, honestly, is so we can even have contact with our holy God. Otherwise, you would be destroyed, just as we read about all these things here in Leviticus, with all the rules and all of those things. And number 2 here in 1 Thessalonians 5:19, we can read that verse. It says, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Messiah Yeshua. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophetic utterances, but examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Well, just not letting the fire go out. God doesn't want us to quench the Spirit. The Spirit of God is what we receive, and it is the joy and the life that's supposed to be alive within us. And we have to be careful that we don't quench the Spirit. Just as importantly as Israel was required to keep the brazen altar ablaze, we literally have to watch ourselves that we do not allow the Spirit to be quenched in our life. Now, B in our notes here, we're talking about the brazen altar. An ascending, draw near sacrifice must continually be lifted up to Yahweh. That's exactly what we just read about here in 1 Thessalonians 5. It says, again, give thanks, pray, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and everything give thanks, for this is the will of God for you. That is a continual thing that we need to keep lifting up before the Lord. The joy of the Lord is our strength, and he really has called us to be a joyful people. I'm personally, I'm not a person that gets depressed. At least I don't think I am. I never think of myself as being depressed. I mean, things happen in life and all of that, but when you step back and realize there is a God who loves you, and he has a plan, he knows what's going on. Even when tough things happen, if you turn to him, he will be there to take care of you. He is faithful. I mean, he's more faithful than all the people, I can guarantee you that. And I mean, people are wonderful. We have some very good people, and we all know some very good people. But truthfully, none really compare with the Lord as far as his faithfulness and his willing to sit with you through everything, to speak to you about everything and anything, and to reveal himself and his love to you, even through some of the toughest things that go on. So we're to have a, let me see if I can get a hold of that. There we go. We aren't to quench the spirit. We are to have an ascending, draw near sacrifice, being lifted up before the Lord every single day. Now, one of the things here that we found out is that um, the Olah offering was to be uh, presented both morning and evening. And truthfully, this actually, if you stop and consider, these these mirror the habits of successful people. Um, Highly successful people start and end each day of their lives on focus. For you and I, our focus really needs to be the Lord. As believers, it's like we start our day with a morning time of spending time with the Lord, whether it be prayer or worship or praise, or just we start our day that way, and we end our day the same way with our focus really, again, being on the Lord. I mean, if um, for highly successful people that are do well in the world system, they follow the same principle. You know, I mean, if they're in finances, they're first thing in the morning, they're checking the stock market, blah blah blah. The last thing before they go to bed, they're checking it again, if that's the kind of financial stuff they're in. But you see what I'm saying is that if we can start and end each day on focus, then in that arena, we are going to be a lot more successful than if we only think of what we're focused on, if you will, just haphazardly. So, it's a discipline. And the offering that was required, the minha offering, the Olah offering, were to be done every morning and every evening, and the fire was to be kept and kept burning. God wanted to have that ascending smoke coming up before him. So, be in our notes here, the classification of sacrifices based on their level of holiness. This is Leviticus 6, verses 14 through, what did I say here? 16. So let's take a look at that. It says, but now this is the law of the grain, the minha offering. The sons of Aaron shall present it before the Lord in front of the altar. Then one of them shall lift it up from it, lift up from it a handful of fine flour of the grain offering, with its oil and all the incense that is on the grain offering, and he shall offer it up in smoke on the altar, a soothing aroma, as its memorial offering to the Lord. What is left of it, Aaron and his sons are to eat. It shall be eaten as unleavened cakes in a holy place. They are to eat it in the court of the tent of meeting. So what we have here, if you will, we have a shift away from what we've been talking about and focusing on the mincha. That's number one in our notes here. We have a shift to the minha, the identification of the priest's portion as being Kodesh, Kodeshim. Verse 17, Leviticus tells us this: it shall not be baked with leaven. Now, this is the portion of the minha they were to eat. I have given it as their share from my offerings by fire. It is most holy. Like the sin, the hatat, purification offering, and the guilt, the Hashem, reparation offering, it is most holy. Now, the idea of the offering being most holy, again, this takes us back where we have to start considering there is a level of holiness that is required to involve yourself or anything's self in its presence. Um, Everything that is used in a holy manner takes on holiness, and that holiness will either destroy it if it's unclean, or it will match it if indeed it is clean and has been sanctified and set apart for that particular use. So, um, A in our notes here is the bloodline priesthood of Aaron experienced imputed holiness status, and consequently, they had a level of protection. Now, the imputed holiness that was imputed to Aaron, God is the only one that can impute that kind of stuff. He imputes things. We can give authority and so on and so forth, but that's a whole different matter than having something imputed to us. We've been imputed with God's righteousness, as we'll see in just a minute here. But in bloodline priesthood, the bloodline of Aaron experienced imputed holiness. Now, on one hand, that's a wonderful thing, and it is a protection, but one of the things we have to still remember, no matter what you're imputed with, obedience and status levels have limitations. That's number one under A. We remember the story of Nadab and Abihu, Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. Now, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Well, wow. If you stop and consider, they, at this point in chapter 10, this is after they've already been consecrated as priests. They've done the offering. This is after the fire came out and consumed the offering. So God was pleased with them. It wasn't that he was, kind of like, I don't know these guys. He knew who they were. However, they still had limitations. And that's something I think that we have to understand. I've heard lots of pastors and, preachers and evangelists and different people talking about, oh, when I see the Lord, I'm just going to run and jump into his lap and say, hi, Daddy. I can't say for sure. I don't know what level of holiness we will be imputed with at that point. But for me personally, I think I would stand back and let somebody else run up and jump into his lap. And if that worked out, I would inquire, am I at that level? Before I just ran up and assumed that I was. I have a feeling that if God establishes limitations, as we have the example here with Nadab and Abihu, there just might be those same kind of limitations in our future relationship with God. I'm not saying yay or nay. I'm saying it's a possibility, and I may not understand it all. So I think I would be a little bit more cautious. But the Lord can certainly give me better reasons to have more optimism and more willingness to run and jump. We'll have to wait and see. Now, believers in Yeshua are imputed with God's righteousness. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30 reads this way. It says, but by his doing, you are Messiah Yeshua. You are in Messiah Yeshua, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, So that just as it is written, let him who boasts boast in the Lord. And 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, he made him who knew no sin to be sin in our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So the righteousness of God has been imputed to us through our faith in him. We in turn are imputed with his righteousness. It's not ours, but it's his. And God, who is the one that's able to impute these things, says that he has done it. We are now the righteousness of God in Messiah Yeshua. So that's a pretty exciting thing to understand. But it also gives us the very clear reason why we must be saved. In verse 18, we read, whoever touches them will become consecrated. This is talking about those things that were offered up before God. And when it's talking about those things that are consecrated, we're talking about things that have taken on a holy status. So what we need here is we need protection from holiness, because holiness, when you come in contact with it and you're not at the level you need to be, it produces destruction. So first of all, we need to be saved. That's number one. And after that, then you need to be somewhat educated. And I think that's one of the important things, hopefully, that we can learn here in our study in Leviticus, is that God clearly defines sin and what it is, all of the various types of sin involved, the limitations that we have. He also clearly identifies what righteousness is and holiness is. And so with that understanding, we can at least have some wisdom in regards to where we can go, what we can do, what we can touch, and all of that kind of stuff that goes along with that. So that's verse 18. And number 2 in our notes here, we're going to look at the biblical patterns that define common, unclean, clean, and holy. And we go to Haggai chapter 2, actually, to look at that. And so let me get here to Haggai. It says, thus says the Lord of hosts, ask now the priest for a ruling. If a man carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches bread with this fold, or cooked food, wine, oil, or any other food, will it become holy? And the priest answered, no. Then Haggai said, if one who is unclean from a corpse touches any of these, will the latter become unclean? And the priest answered, it will become unclean. Then Haggai said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, declares the Lord, and so is every work of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean. So what we're understanding here, if something's unclean, it can take something that has been made holy and defile it. Now, we're talking about a second step. We're not talking about first step. The first step is touching God or being in his presence and being unclean. In that case, first step situation leads to destruction. But if something has been set apart as holy and somebody who's unclean touches it, then that thing that was set apart to be used in a holy manner then becomes unclean and unfit for usage. So we can see that we have a process, and so the biblical patterns that define common and all of that. A in our notes, uncleanliness contact defiles clean. Holy contact destroys the unclean and the common. We read in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, these words concerning that. It says, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Messiah Yeshua, through whom also we have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we exult in hope of the glory of God. So here we have a verse identifying for us. Let me get back to where I was. That holy contact destroys the unclean in common. And talking about number 3, the priest's personal anointing offerings were completely Yahweh's, and they were not to be eaten. If God set something apart for his purpose, then it has to be utilized for that purpose. Otherwise, if it's misused, then what happens is that in regards to the offerings anyway, the offerings become null and void. If somebody misuses something that's holy in the process of trying to please God, well, then what they're trying to accomplish is not accomplished at all. It becomes null and void. So Leviticus chapter 6, verses 19 through 23, we read these words. It said, "Then the Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, This is the offering which Aaron and his sons are to present to the Lord on the day when he is anointed. The tenth of an ephah of fine flour is a regular grain offering, half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. It shall be prepared with oil on a griddle. When it is well stirred, you shall bring it. You shall present the grain offering in baked pieces as a soothing aroma to the Lord. The anointed priest who will be in his place," that's talking about the high priest, "among his sons shall offer it. By a permanent ordinance, it shall be entirely offered up in smoke to the Lord. So every grain offering of the priest shall be burned entirely. It shall not be eaten." Now, this right here, if you remember, when we were talking about the minha uh, and the offerings before, if it came from the regular Levite, that some of these offerings were able to be eaten. But if it's from the priest on behalf of the priest, then nobody is to eat it. It is to be completely burnt before the Lord. So there's a change here that takes place when the priest is making an offering. And so one of the things here we need to see these changes and how they relate to different levels of society within the community. We're going to find out that what the high priest offers is at a different level than the normal priest. What the normal priest offers a different level, of course, than community members, depending on if they're a leader within the tribe or if they're just a member. We went through that last week and a couple of weeks ago, so we ought to be fairly familiar with the fact that different offerings and different sins have different requirements as to what can be done with them and who can participate and who cannot. So, and we have A in our notes here. Now, we need to understand one thing that we have to take a moment to realize. There's a couple of things that are going on. One of them is this is not very long after Moses has been on the mountain, come down. We had the golden calf incident. Moses went back up, he came back down, and we're in the process of preparing to anoint Aaron and his sons as priests. And so this is the process we're talking about. Aaron has not been anointed yet, but we're preparing for that. And so when we're talking about these things, in our notes, these are instructions for the future consecration and anointing of the priest. And God is giving us special restrictions for that process. So some of what we're reading here, we have to realize it is very specific for the consecration of the high priest Aaron and his son. So the priest mincha must be made into baked pieces and completely burnt before the Lord. It could have been made in all kinds of different concoctions previously, with just when it's presented on behalf of one of the Israelites. But here it had to be made into baked pieces and completely consumed on the holy altar. Then we come right after this in verse 24 and 29. We're going to shift to the hot purification offering. And this is for a common Israelite, but it becomes a holy meal for the priest and for the priest only. And so we read in 24-29 these words. Then the Lord spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is slain, the sin offering shall be slain before the Lord. It is most holy. Now, most holy is a very specific designation. The priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. It shall be eaten in a holy place, in the court of the tent of meeting. Anyone who touches its flesh will become consecrated, and when any of his blood splashes on a garment in a holy place, you shall wash what was splashed on. Also, the earthenware vessel in which it was boiled shall be broken. And if it was boiled in a bronze vessel, then it shall be scoured and rinsed in water. Every male among the priests may eat of it. It is most holy. So, this was, in A in our notes, this was the priest's offering of a purification offering that belongs totally to Yahweh and is consumed by fire, according to verse 30. 6:30 says, but no sin offering, and we're going to talk about a sin offering, of which any of the blood is brought into the tent of meeting to make atonement in the holy place shall be eaten. It shall be burned with fire. So again, we have a differentiation between that which is brought by a regular Israelite and one that is presented on behalf of the priest. And so God takes us through these things and makes these things clear to us so that we know that there are very specific things that can and cannot be done. Now, when we get to the Brit Hadashah, and Paul is talking, and Peter and all of the rest of the disciples, whether in conversation or in writing, when we read of sin offerings and so on and so forth, depending on what is done, then we can begin to identify what sin offering they're specifically talking about. And, one of those that Paul was involved with was specifically the Zavah offering. And we'll talk about that in a little while later. But at this point, number 5 in our notes, we're going to shift to the Asham, the reparation offering. And we're going to talk about its restrictions, which are identical to the Hatat offering. That's Leviticus 7, 2 through 10. In the place where they slay the burnt offering, they are to slay the guilt offering. That's speaking about the reparation offering. And he shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. Then he shall offer it with all of its fat, the fat tail and the fat that covers the entrails, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is on them, which is on the loins, and the lobe of a liver he shall remove with the kidneys. The priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as an offering by fire to the Lord. It is a reparation offering. Every male among the priests may eat of it. It shall be eaten in a holy place. It is most holy. The guilt offering is like the sin offering. There is one law for them. The priest who makes atonement with it shall have it. Also the priest who presents any man's burnt offering, that priest shall have for himself the skin of the burnt offering, which he has presented. Likewise, every grain offering that is baked in the oven, and everything prepared in a pan or on a griddle shall belong to the priest who presents it. Every grain offering mixed with oil or dry shall belong to all the sons of Adonai, to all alike. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here because we have the very same procedure between the Hashem and the Ha'atat offering. We come next, the number 6 in our notes, we come to the Zavah, the peace offering. And this offering is a Kodesh Kalim offering, one that can be shared. Now, when we were back previously, we actually had an offering that was identified differently. It was the, let's see if I find it here, the Kodesh. I have to go look at that and find it. If I can find it, I knew what it was, and for the life of me right now, it's like my brain goes blank every once in a while. So I'll get back to it. It'll come to me in a moment. It usually does. So what we have is, this is the peace offering. It's a Kodesh Kalim offering, one that can be shared. And that's presented for us in Leviticus 7:11 through 27. We're not going to read all of that. You can, if you've already read the chapter, you can read that and see what it is. In our notes right underneath it, the restrictions and protocol surrounding the sharing of the peace offering. That's verses 19 through 27. And then 1, the worshiper himself is to present the breast as a wave offering before Adonai. That's verses 29 and 30. Now we're going to stop here and look at this. Let me move our notes up a little bit. I don't know if you can see them well or not, so let me see if I can move them all up. Okay, here we go. So we have the Zavah peace offering, and then we have the restrictions and protocol. And then the worshiper himself is to present the breast as a wave offering before Adonai. So 29 and 30 says, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, he who offers the sacrifice of his peace offerings to the Lord shall bring his offering to the Lord from the sacrifice of his peace offering. His own hands are to bring offerings by fire to the Lord. He shall bring the fat with the breast, that the breast may be presented as a wave offering before the Lord." Now, this does not mean that he is in any way to do anything with the altar. But what he is to do, he is to take the breast, if you will, which is the chest cavity, and the other assigned parts, and he is to lift them up before the Lord, rave them over his head, which is what we do actually on Shavuot. This is exactly what we do. And this actually is the tenufa. The tenufa is the Hebrew meaning for the wave offering that's lifted up above the head and presented before God. And I want to read this for you. One of the things that God has said in Deuteronomy 16 is, it's important to know that we are not to appear before the Lord empty-handed. And the wave offering really is part of that. Now, 3 times in the year, all the males, of course, shall appear before the Lord our God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. So this was, as I said, this is a teruma, and this was a type of first fruits offering, and was presented by lifting it above your shoulders and waving it above your head back and forth. Now, we have a couple of occurrences when this kind of offering was made. And it does represent an obedience to God. One of the things we have to absolutely get a hold of is the importance of obedience to God. It doesn't matter, and I think all of us with Western mindsets have a problem with this. It doesn't matter if you understand it completely or not, but if God has given us an obligation, we literally are responsible to follow through with that obligation. And one of those protocols in regards to appearing before the Lord on these pilgrim festivals is to not come empty handed. And what we present before the Lord, at Shavuot, we usually bring some of the produce that was uh, identified in Deuteronomy 8 as growing in the land of Israel. And we bring some of those things and we present that as an offering before the Lord. Well, this Shavuot, we will do that as well. But there's something else that we're going to do in Shavuot that fits into the Teruma offering. When Israel was about to go up into the land, God called for a half a shekel requirement for every person 20 years old and above to present to the temple as a teruma offering. The offering was an identification. It identified those that were going up into the land as being submitted to and obedient to God. Now, in times past, we haven't brought this up. We haven't utilized it. But this year, we've spent a little more time studying and realizing that we are Shiloh right now. We're going through a time in which God has paused us, if you will, and given us an opportunity to consider who we are and where we are. When we're released, if that comes, whether it happens before Shavuot or after, at Shavuot is when we're commanded to appear before the Lord and to come, and we're not supposed to appear empty-handed. So we're going to this year, we're going to ask the congregation, everybody 20 years and above, for each person to make an offering of half a shekel. In figuring out the value of half a shekel, it comes to $5 basically. Now, when we take a look at this and realize, all right, so $5, what is it for? It identifies us as belonging to God. It is what was presented before the Lord. Instead of counting people, God kept track of the people by those that were willing to be identified as belonging to Him. And so the counting of the half shekel rather than the person became the procedure for understanding who was with Israel, who was part of Israel, and who was not. We don't count people because in counting people, when you count people, you have either two responses. One is pride. Oh, look how many we've got. And so the tendency is to look at that and go, okay, well, we got this many people. That means we can do such and such based on the number of people. Well, God really is not into that. He wants us to identify with Him and our ability and our blessing to be with Him, not on how many people we have. So rather than counting people, He said, I want you to bring half a shekel to identify who's with the congregation and who's not. And plus, when you count people, if you have a few people, then people get discouraged. Despair sets in. We know if we had a bigger group of people, we might be able to do more. Well, 12 people turned the world upside down that just trusted Yeshua. So we're trying to stay away from the number game, if you will, and the pitfalls of it. But we definitely do want to do this, because God in his word tells us that those that would give the half shekel would then be immune from the plague that would follow. And so, we absolutely, at this time when we've got this COVID-19 stuff going around, we don't want anybody being subjected to any part of any kind of plague. And this time frame is very much, in my opinion, and is becoming everybody's opinion, it's one of separation. Now, God has separated us into our own homes, that's true. The government, of course, is using that for their advantage to accomplish what they want. But when our eyes are focused on the Lord, we are becoming stronger in our conviction and in our understanding of what God is doing. And with that, when we come back out of this and come out together, we need to come out on our faces before God, giving him glory, thanking him, and worshiping him, realizing that he set us apart to prepare us for the battle that's ahead. We are going to be crossing over into a new territory. Um, we have this time frame is identifying, I would hope for everybody, just how big the giants are that we're going to be facing. And to identify with the Lord by presenting our half shekel of $5 for every 20-year-old and above. It actually is like a mark that God places upon us, saying, yeah, that's my son, my daughter right there. They have committed themselves to being submitted to me, obedient to me. And as a result, my anointing is going to be on them. And so this year at Shavuot, which, by the way, is going to be next Thursday, um, which means we will not be having a Leviticus study, but we do need to tune in for sure, because we will be having our Shavuot service. And at that time is when we will be presenting our wave offerings. And so what we're going to do is, with the giving that you can do online, uh, we're just going to take it in. You have to put it in through the tithe or um, whichever way you put it in, but just designate it as your Shavuot half shekel offering. And that way you will be covered. We'll be submitting ourselves to what God required for the nation of Israel when they knew they were going up into the land and they were going to be facing giants. Well, that's what we know as well. And so consequently, we're getting prepared to be those people called by his name, anointed by him, and ready and willing to go. So that's a tenufa, the wave offering that's lifted above the head and presented before the Lord. Now, with the wave offering here, God gave the wave offering breast and thigh, excuse me, to Aaron's descendants forever. That's verse 34 that we read there. Let me get back over here. 7:34, it says, I have taken the breast of the wave offering and the thigh of the contribution from the sons of Israel, from the sacrifices of their peace offerings, and have given them to Aaron the priest and to his son as their due forever from the sons of Israel. Now, that concludes actually chapter 7. And Roman numeral number 2 in our notes, we transfer into chapter 28. And then here's where we see the ordination procedure for Aaron, the first high priest, and his sons. A in our notes where we read in the text, actually, we read verses 3 through 5. I think that would probably be the best thing. It said, and assemble all the congregation at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So Moses did just as the Lord commanded him. When the congregation was assembled at the doorway of the tent of meeting, Moses said to the congregation, this is a thing which the Lord has commanded to do. Now, let me say this. I know people have a tendency to say all Israel means literally everybody. I do not believe that for a number of reasons. First of all, if you've ever been to a concert of any kind, uh, if you if you have 10,000 people uh, and you don't have amplification and it's not set up so that you can see up on a stage or have pictures or something showing, nobody can understand what you're saying, even if you're shouting. The physical limitations that are there are just way beyond the capacity to have 3 million people. God works through representation. He established tribal leaders. He established elders. He did have and did establish a hierarchy, and he used it. Um, I mean, even going up to Jerusalem, the whole family was not required. The men were required. And of course, many men, they took their whole family. But at the same time, I would believe that many times the wife did not go up. She would stay home if she had little children, if they had, things to care for and nobody else to do that. You can't just go away for a week and leave your animals and things like that to fend for themselves. You have to provide a means for that to be taken care of and still obey God. So we have to use a little insight into how life actually works and realize that when God said all Israel, it's not literal, but it's representatives. In our government right here in the United States, we have a representative government. Our biggest problem is we vote in representatives and then send them to Washington and don't pay any attention to them after that. They do go and do all kinds of stuff that, then we find out this has become law and we go, well, what happened? Well, we're not paying any attention to our representatives. But as our representatives make laws and regulations and so on and so forth, when God judges a nation, he judges it from the representative standpoint. And unfortunately, if our representatives are anti-Semitic, if they're ungodly people, those of us that allowed them to become our representatives will suffer the consequences. And so we have to realize God has always worked that way. He continues to work that way. And so we are not exempt when we put people over our nation that lead our nation that do not know the Lord. We will be judged on the basis of our leadership. So I hope that we can recognize that and be a lot more diligent in being concerned about who does get elected and who represents us. Um, if we, that's part of what's coming, in my belief, and the reason why we need to have God's covering and his special anointing and being set apart for his purpose. God said, with the nation of Israel, he said, I will go before you. If you will listen to me and obey me, I will go before you, and then you will have success. And so hopefully that's what we can latch on to and learn and be prepared. Doing what we need to do spiritually, yes, but learning how to listen to God and to stand strong in our conviction that we are the head and not the tail. I mean, I'm tired of being part of the tail. Um, we need to move to our position that God has promised us that the wealth of the wicked is being stored up for the righteous. I mean, it's time for us to experience that. And so hopefully, don't let me get started on this vein, but hopefully we can see that from right here. God has very specifically ordained things and established things. So one in our notes, the procedure begins with washing with water. We realize that water cleanses. That would be in verse 6. And it is figurative. Water cleanses. It's a figurative use of water. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 26 says this. It says, husbands, treat your wives just as Messiah also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So when you start out with the procedure that God actually began by washing Aaron and his sons, it's a humbling thing to realize that Aaron and his sons were not clean. They needed to be sanctified. They needed to be set apart, as everybody does. So it begins with washing of the washing of the water of the word, etc., etc. So number 2, all things had to be cleansed. The priests, their clothes, the altars, everything. And the reason is lest they be destroyed. You know, if you're going to go into the holy presence of God and you got anything that's unclean, it will be destroyed. That's just the bottom line of how this kind of stuff works. So one thing that we can recognize, and one thing we need to recognize, is in our notes that defilement is instantaneous. Cleansing and consecration takes time. There was 7 days of ordination. Verses 33 through 36 says, you shall not go out the doorway of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the day that the period of your ordination is fulfilled. For he will ordain you through 7 days. It's a 7-day process. By the way, if you had a skin disease, if you remember, it was a 7-day process for that to be checked and to prove that you did not have it anymore, that you were clean. So the same kind of procedure. So, for he will ordain you through 7 days. The Lord has commanded to do as he has done this day, to make atonement on your behalf at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Moreover, you shall remain day and night for 7 days and keep the charge of the Lord, so that you will not die. For I have been commanded, this is Moses speaking. Thus Aaron and his sons did all the things which the Lord had commanded through Moses. So we have a 7-day process, and it was a required time for them to absolutely stay where they were. The key to this is defilement can happen instantaneously, but cleansing and consecration takes time. Keep that in mind. You know, we have a tendency to think, okay, well, you know, I did this, but I realized mistake, so I confessed it. Now everything's perfectly back to normal. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe, but I would look at it and say, okay, Lord, what I think the Lord does, this is what I think, okay? I think the Lord gives you an absolute yes. Now prove it by your actions. You're going to go back and do that again? Is the dog going to return to its vomit? That's the opportunity God gives us. You get to prove, are you truly repentant? Or are you just sorry you got caught? honestly, in the past, I've been sorry I got caught. And so I ended up going back to the same thing again. And then it's like, oh, wow, Lord. And fortunately for me, and I think for many other people, that God does give us, we get to begin again. Um, I don't want to rely on that, but thank God that He is merciful and gives us that opportunity, because I know that I have done things more than once thinking, oh man, why did I do that? Man, forgive me, Lord, and all of that. And then, you know, 6 months or a year or 2 years later, you find out you're doing the same thing. You didn't learn anything from the first time. And of course, the Lord knows that stuff. We're the ones that have to discover it. So I think that's part of the process that God gives us opportunity to discover really what's inside of us. He knows, and He puts up with us, but we're not so bright that we get it. And so I think sometimes God gives us opportunity. There used to be the old saying, you get enough rope to hang yourself, and unfortunately, some of us been hung more than once, and I have to admit that would include me. All right, going on, Roman numeral number 3, chapter 9. We're going to talk about the 8th day. This is the 8th day. It's a new beginning time. And we realize right away the empowerment and authorization of the priesthood. This is where there's a transition that's going to take place in chapter 9. What God does right here in chapter 9, verse 2. Let me make sure I got my Bible open to the right chapter here. I have a tendency to leave it around. Now it came about on the 8th day that Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. And he said to Aaron, take for yourself a calf, a bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and offer them before the Lord. Well, now here we're going to have an interesting little thing, and I want to make sure you get this part. It's a new beginning. That's Roman numeral number 3. The 8th day is always going to represent a new beginning. 8 always represents new something. Even the steps leading up into the temple is described in Ezekiel. You had 7 steps from the outer, 8 from the inner court up inside. So lots of things like that. But where it says, take for yourself a calf, the Hebrew word is egel. It's an unusual term to describe this offering. The usual term is ben par, which indicates a young bull. That's typically the terminology that would be used. But egel is unusual. And so what makes it kind of an interesting thing here is in Exodus 32, verse 4, where we're talking about the molten calf that Aaron and his sons formed in fashion for Israel, the golden calf. That was also called egel. Interestingly enough, Yahweh remembers, and it's like He's making a point here. He said, I want you to offer up an egel. Remember just a few weeks ago what you offered? Well, here, this is what I want you to offer. And I want you to get the idea that I'm telling you something that I don't want you to ever forget. It's kind of an interesting point. You don't pick it up unless you actually see it in the Hebrew, but it's something you can write down in your notes and make a point to remember. The golden calf, everybody goes, well, what about Aaron? He seemed to get away with everything. God didn't discipline him for his participation in that. Well, here we have God bringing Aaron to a place and saying, hey, remember what you did? Well, here, this is the calf I want you to offer up. And, these offerings that took place here, they were effective. This is not for a willful sin against God, but it's a sin nature. Now, there's lots of discussion as to what Aaron was thinking and doing, and I've read it all. I've thought about it. I've had opinions. I've changed my mind. Um, I really don't know. I don't know if it's any of my beeswax, so to speak. Um, all I do know is that here God is bringing up a word that was used previously, and it's an unusual word. So there is a connection being made, and we're making note of it. So Yahweh remembers and makes a point. Moses said to Aaron, be in our notes, come near to the altar. Well, when he said to him, come near, this is the transfer of administration. This is a transfer that changes the position that Moses was in regards to working within the temple, working within the tabernacle, uh, and serving God in the capacity he had been. It's a transference over to Aaron. From this point on, in verse 7, Moses no longer comes in to the holy place and functions in that capacity. And interestingly enough, when Joshua took over for Moses, Joshua never took over this position either. Moses had a very unique relationship and position before the Lord. And honestly, I mean, even with Yeshua, Moses said that God was going to raise up a man likened unto him that everybody was supposed to listen to. Well, Moses held an esteemed position and still does hold an esteemed position before the Lord and before the Jewish people for sure. And it should be likewise for us. If you remember, Moses was one of those that appeared with Yeshua uh, on the Mount of Transfiguration. So Moses is not done. Moses is still a very formidable character and part of uh, what God has done, and I think part of what he's going to be doing in the future. It'd be very interesting to see what position Moses continues to hold. So I know he defers to Yeshua as Messiah, not saying anything about that whatsoever, but Moses certainly has held an esteemed position, and be interesting to see what the future holds in that regard. So we have here number one in our notes is make your hatat purification offering, and Olah, the draw near offering for you and for the people. That was the instructions that Aaron then went ahead and completed those things. Number two, the Hatat purification offering for the people was a goat. Uh, and again, when he made the Hatat purification offering for himself and his sons, remember, it was a young bull called Egel at this time, but it was a young bull, and that was for the sins of the priest. You got to remember, Aaron and his sons were human beings. They had a sin nature, and so they were unclean and needed to be sanctified. So they did that for themselves. The offering for the people was a goat. It was of lesser value because the people had less of an influence in the representative government of the nation. The high priest and the priesthood were at the top as far as responsibilities and influence that could bring harm to the nation. The people were part of that procedure and all of that, but they were not at the top, so a goat was used. See in our notes, of course, then we have Aaron who pronounced the blessing over the people. And of course, that would have been the Aaronic benediction. from Numbers chapter 6, 22 through 27. So we have here Aaron lifting up his hands and probably I would say, very clearly lifting his hands in this position, forming the sheen and pronouncing the blessing over God's people. D in our notes, then we have at this point, this is verse 22, 23 and 24 of chapter 9. And this is where then fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. Well, I'm sure they fell on their faces. I mean, was it fear? I mean, you're watching something supernatural take place. Fire coming out from before the Lord and consuming things right before your eyes. It should give you a realistic approach to the fact that God is real and He is powerful and He is also dangerous. And so I think that was a manifestation, I think, that was done on purpose to cement within the people that were there the reality of the awesome power and authority of God and the danger that comes with them, that when they went back as representatives to the people, they went back and they would absolutely be right there and be totally involved in letting people know, listen, I saw it with my own eyes. This is what happened. And that's an extraordinary thing to consider. So with that, that's we made it through chapter 10. Now there's a lot of stuff in chapter 9 and 10 and in all of the chapters actually that we're not covering specifically. However, a lot of those things we've gone through, and you can recognize what's going on, what offerings were being made, and you even know the difference now between those that were offered on behalf of different groups within the hierarchy of the nation. And you know a lot more about the offerings than we ever have in the past. So at this point, I'm believing that all of us, when we read our text, we read our Bibles, that we will be able to pick out these things and be able to understand why and what God is doing in every circumstance where offerings are brought up, whether it's in the Tanakh or whether it's in the Brit Hadashah. And that literally has been my goal to bring us to this place. Now, I'd like to say before we close the meeting, and we'll talk in a minute, but next, on Saturday afternoon, we're going to have a very busy Shabbat, of course. But Saturday afternoon is Rosh Hashanah at 7 in the evening, and it's the month of Sivan. So I will be conducting a Rosh Hashanah service. It'll be right here on my Leviticus study format. We'll join at 7, and we'll have a Rosh Hashanah service. Now, the other thing I want to announce before we all start talking is next Monday is Memorial Day. And so on Memorial Day, I'm not going to have a service. We will skip Memorial Day. And then on Thursday is Shavuot. The reason we're skipping Memorial Day is because with what I've witnessed so far this week, and getting out of the house, I think there is a tremendous amount of people that are going to be out doing stuff. I don't know if that'll include you or not, but if it is, enjoy Memorial Day. take the time, spend time with some people that are veterans or something, and do something good with the time. On Shavuot, I'll be doing the message, so I also need some time to get the message put together that we can actually have a message I think that the Lord would have us to hear. So anyway, with that, did you guys hear me at all during this time? Okay. All right. Good. Because I never know. I mean, once I turn this thing over and I start doing it, it's like, I'd like to be able to see you, but when I see you, all of you then become part of the recording. And when we put it up for people to watch, I get to watch all of you and me and all of the rest of that stuff. So anyway, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourselves, you're welcome to do that. If you have any questions,